What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the Virtual Railroader Academy. I'm Professor Casey.
And I'm Professor Nick, and welcome to another fine episode or class of Railroaders Play Railroader.
And my game is crashing.
Yep, and I am going down for the count as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll be right back after these messages. Let's
Assuming you have,
assuming it,
assuming you have messages. If
assuming I
you're
do have
getting a
messages.
commercial right now, then now is a great time to be having those commercials.
There should be something on the screen shortly. Um,
You have a black screen and I got kicked too.
yep, it's going back up. Well, that was fun, everyone. Kicking off this evening wonderfully. We are here tonight to talk about branch lines, and frankly, Nick and I were wrapping our heads of how to do this one, and it kind of came to me. There's no one better to talk branch lines than our good friend Rick from the Boston and Maine Society. The class one that was arguably all branch lines, I think, is a good way of putting it. So,
Yeah,
Pretty accurately, yeah.
everyone,
For sure.
welcome in Rick, previous guest, and we're happy to have him back again tonight. And game
Hey,
is
glad
back
to be
up for
back.
everyone.
Yay.
I
So,
mean,
yeah,
when I think of the Boston and Maine, I do tend to think of branch lines or interchange points, or and the Hoosac Tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, can't forget the tunnel.
Uh,
And I think everyone knows me for this by now. I think of moguls when I think of the Boston, Maine, and the weird blue Pacific. That's it. But it's like the mogul with the B&M open vestibule cars is like you talk Boston and Maine, you talk New England railroading, even that's what first pops into my mind is that kind of small, out of the way stuff going up into the woods to the small villages, the paper mills, the quarries. That's in my head. That's branch line railroading.
Yeah, the B&M is such an interesting railroad because if you look at like the first person perspective of a lot of people, rail fans and people back in say 1950, 51, 52, you could take a weekend and spend it on the
Um,
Boston and Maine.
okay, I don't know
Um,
who's doing what, but it just crashed the game again.
oh no.
I tried moving 1455,
All right,
so maybe, but that
are you
wasn't
using the
first.
mod?
Yeah,
Let's
So
try not
I
using the
can-
rail driver mod.
yeah, I can
And
try
try that
shutting
another
that
night.
off. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, trying new stuff tonight, guys. Sorry about that. But you were saying about New England.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Everybody kind of has a different perspective of the B&M, and that's kind of the neat thing about the railroad is that there was a lot of almost sort of a dichotomy between rural and urban where you could visit one part of the system and have basically essentially urban commuter trains and long distance passenger trains with modern power. You know, you had the Flying Yankee, the Streamliner 6000, but then a bulk of the Boston and Maine was built up of these branch lines, which kind of spiderwebbed in all different directions and served a variety of different places and industries, um, which kind of is because of the railroad was built up of a lot of predecessor lines, and so it was kind of the result of sort of mergers and absorption rather than just organic creation. But yeah, the B&M means a lot of different things to a lot of people, which is kind of funny about the railroad. But certainly that branch line feel is kind of what permeates a lot of people's attention when it comes to the B&M, and so much so that a large bulk of the railroad in New Hampshire was actually known as Mogul Country because of that sort of image that kind of lasted until the mid to late 20th century. So yeah.
God, yeah, that's it's weird that out of all the New England railroading I've gotten. Oh, you're going around that way. I was getting the turntable ready for you.
Oh, I'll go the other way then.
All right, I'll go tie onto the train then, and I'll meet you over there.
Keto.
So on the note of mogul country, we should probably tell the folks what we're doing tonight. And if you haven't guessed already, it's a little bit. This is gonna be a New England pontification stream, because it's near and dear to quite a few of our hearts here in the VRA. But also, and yeah, they existed out on the West Coast and in the South and in the Midwest. But there's something about that. If you ever looked at a map of New England railroading, that, as Rick put it, the spider web of all the different rail lines and short lines that were all merged into the Boston and Maine, the Maine Central, the New Haven, Central Vermont, a little bit as well. It's kind of the,
Rutland.
at least for me, the Rutland of what pops up of like, yes, this is a branch line. So we're going to be running mogul country up to Alarka tonight. We've got a local heading up that way, and some switching to do up there, and some fun Easter eggs along the way. But yeah, so we're gonna be doing a little bit of B&M railroading. I think we cultivated nicely tonight.
You mentioned, Rick, that with the B&M, that a lot of kind of how it came to be was through mergers and acquisitions. Is that what it saw itself as? Like, what was the sort of core of the B&M that then got built on with all these branch lines?
Yeah, so the Boston and Maine Railroad itself originated as its own railroad between Boston and Lawrence, Massachusetts, and eventually extended its construction on what became known as the Western Route Main Line up through the seacoast of New Hampshire towards Portland. So initially that was the Boston and Maine, really not much more than that, and it wasn't the most powerful railroad in that. Oh, we lose it again?
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Who did what when we crashed? Was anyone
I was
trying
all-
to spawn something?
Nope. I was just backing up, and I'm not using the rail driver.
I was stopped at a station.
Al Perlman, were you spawning anything or doing anything? Trying to figure out what's causing the crash here. Okay, so we'll. I don't know why this may be a painful one tonight, guys. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm staring at my GP38. I'm gonna delete GP38 and see.
Yeah, don't spawn GP38s tonight.
Oh no, it's not spawned. I didn't.
Oh.
It was already spawned on the save when we crashed.
Oh.
It was fine.
Huh.
And then something happened and we crashed. I don't know. All right, so I'm gonna get rid of it and see if that fixes it.
I will make it past Dillsboro, I swear.
Okay, there it goes. Now responding. Well,
So, Boston and Maine, see how it sees itself in its origin. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah, so basically, New England at that time period, we're talking like 1830s to 1850s, was seeing sort of an explosion of railroad charters, where basically you had everybody from prominent politicians to prominent businessmen were going forward with railroad charters, and putting them before legislation and having them created basically to serve small areas. Basically you would have like the Boston and Lowell, or you would have these small railroads that basically only served a small area. And these charters were being approved left and right, and so you ended up having a ton of railroad companies in a small geographic area, all kind of competing and vying for each other. And that sort of rapid overbuilding ended up creating a lot of problems in terms of coordination between the railroads, in terms of uh, the economics of the different companies interacting with each other, passengers and scheduling and all these things. It was just kind of too complicated too quickly. And so by the 1860s, 1870s, you started to see a small number of dominant companies sort of swallowing up the competition either through outright purchasing or, quote unquote, 99-year leases. And by the time like the 1880s, 1890s roll around, there's a handful of large companies in New England. Those companies being the Concord Railroad, the Concord and Montreal, the Boston and Lowell, and the Boston and Maine, and the Eastern Railroad as well, which kind of served eastern Massachusetts and up into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And eventually, by 1900, the Boston and Maine sort of emerged as the dominant railroad company in this part of New England because they were pretty aggressive about their acquisition of these smaller companies, buying them up, swallowing them up, leasing them, through political means. The Boston and Maine was extremely politically powerful. It was actually said at one point in time that the Boston and Maine basically controlled the government of New Hampshire because they had so much influence over the state government. And I believe at one point in time there was even intermixing with, the governor of New Hampshire was involved with the B&M structure and things like that. So it was one of the first super corporations, really, of its time. So tied into just about every aspect of life in this part of New England. But basically it led to some problems because, when initially you had dozens of companies, now you have one company controlling a vast territory. And in some cases where you had like 3 separate railroad companies serving Lowell, Massachusetts, for example, now you have just the Boston and Maine serving Lowell with 4 different lines in and out of the city. And that led to a lot of redundancy, which is one of the reasons why later on in the 20th century, some of these branch lines would start to suffer because under different ownership, that's fine. But when you have one company owning lines that go the same place 3 times, it's not exactly economically feasible. So an interesting start for sure. But it took about 60, 70 years for the B&M to really kind of become the juggernaut that it would be in the 20th century.
Wow. And there were so many recognizable names of short lines in there. Or not short lines, of recognizable branches in that mix of... you didn't mention the Fitchburg, but that one popped into my head as you were going.
That's right.
Concord.
Yep, that was a Concord. Yeah.
Alright, I got control of 1455, Nick. You ready to head up the hill?
I'm ready here.
Alright, here we go.
Yeah, the Fitchburg, you mentioned the Fitchburg. That's a really interesting story. And the Fitchburg Railroad, of course, which built its way from Boston westward through northern Massachusetts, through places like Concord, Massachusetts, out towards Deerfield and Greenfield, and then eventually the Hoosick Tunnel into Vermont and New York State. The Fitchburg, around about 1890, 1895, was neck and neck with the Boston and Maine. They were separate companies, but they were both very competitive, and they were both very powerful. And if history had proved a little differently, you could have easily seen the Fitchburg Railroad become the dominant railroad in New England rather than the Boston and Maine. That's how sort of strong both of those 2 railroads were. But the Boston and Maine leased the Fitchburg in perpetuity in 1900. And so right at the turn of the century, the Boston and Maine kind of won the race. But it's very possible that the Fitchburg could have been a more powerful company. Of course, having that main line, but also the Fitchburg had a lot of branches too, which the Boston and Maine acquired eventually. So yeah, very interesting. The corporate history of railroading in New England. When you look at the way things were like out west, where kind of generalizing here, but a lot of the companies out west started large and stayed large. There were certainly a lot of smaller companies that got swallowed up, and then you have like the narrow gauge situation and all of that. But New England had a lot of really small companies that became large companies, whereas out west you had like the Union Pacific and some of those railroads that kind of started big and stayed big. So
Even their small, like even the small lines out there started large and stayed large. Like you think of the Nevada
yeah,
Northern, it's a 300 something, 200 something mile long short line
mhm,
with
yeah,
60-mile-an-hour track, and that like it's a very different feeling than. And I think this is what, and the community knows this about my pontificating about New England steam as of late, but like it's kind of what draws me into the New England railroading scene is like just the spider web of it all and how interconnected it was and how much small stuff popped up. And not a
yeah,
New Englander myself, but looking at local railroads and like, oh, there was a local narrow gauge railroad here, and like, what did that do? And like, oh, and that became a part of this class one, and like, it's New England Northeast has a very interesting feeling and vibe and history to
yeah.
how it all became where we are today.
Yeah, part of that condensed nature of it is what makes it so fascinating. I mean, you talk about, rural railroading out west being these 50, 60, 70-mile lines that are branch lines, but they're enormous. And part of that, eventually, as we'll get to, I assume later in the conversation, how a lot of the branch lines in New England disappeared, and a lot of it had to do with the short distances. I mean, you have a 25-mile branch line in New England. Once trucks come around, the trucks can serve that pretty easily in a single day. Whereas out west, you have longer distances to cover, so the railroads survived longer and were healthier longer. But in New England, you had a lot of these really short rural lines that, once the trucks came in and took over the traffic, that sort of image of railroading disappeared. And
Yeah,
the condensed nature of it, when you think about like some of these small towns and the fact that you could drive an hour from Boston and be in the heart of the White Mountains of New Hampshire in small, 400, 500 resident towns being served by steam locomotives with wooden covered bridges, and you're an hour from the largest city in New England. Um, it's just crazy when you think about it.
it really is. And like my town, not New England, New York. So like we didn't have that kind of tight knit railroading, especially in my area because of the Catskills. Like
Mm,
the escarpment along the Hudson kind of it keeps you very limited to the two sides of the river, and then the 1,000-foot cliff face on each side.
yeah.
But like the branch line in my local town, it was Erie Railroad. By the 30s, it was a doodle bug, and by 40, it was replaced with trucks.
Yep. Yep.
And it went away as quickly as it showed up in our part of the world.
Yeah, you think about the
Well,
timeline
well,
here.
yeah. Continue. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're talking about half a lifetime. I mean, if you're born in 1920, and by the time you're 50 years old in the 1970s, it's possible that line, which was at its peak in the 1920s, is non-existent in the 1970s. Um, it's not a long time at all, really. That's a
No,
blink of an eye. So,
it's
yeah.
our grandparents' life. I mean, speaking for myself, but like that's my grandparents' lifetime, more or less.
Hmm. Yep.
And that's kind of insane to think about how quickly it showed up and how quickly it went away. But I don't want to get into too much into the end of the branch line. Plus, they're cool. We
Mhm.
focus on that still.
Yeah.
Allison
Like,
Chains 3718 writes, the difference between the East and West, the East developed railroads and the West was developed by railroads.
yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
I think that's a good
Yeah.
way to put it.
I really like
Excellent.
that.
Yeah.
Great way to throw that out.
Yeah, the East outgrew them a lot quicker. We found other ways of transportation that were quicker and more condensed, and the West, still had a lot of distance to cover. So, yeah.
So, for the B&M with its hundreds of branch lines, what are some of the quote-unquote famous ones? Like, what were some of the distinct ones in their network?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different distinctions, and some of it goes into operations, some of it goes into landscapes and geography. Um, the thing about the Boston and Maine is you had a lot of lines that were originally through lines that maybe connected Lowell to Lawrence, Lawrence, Massachusetts to Lowell, Massachusetts, that in 1900 was a full complete line, but by 1930 that had been truncated into two separate halves. They cut the middle section and abandoned it. So now you have two dead-end branches, which are served in different directions. So a lot of the Boston and Maine's branch lines were like that. They had originally been through routes that connected one place to another place with an outlet on either end to a main line. And by the 1930s, because of flood damage or the hurricanes that they had in the 1930s, or just basic economics, a lot of these lines became separated and truncated. So there's kind of a varied distinction. You get all kinds of flavor, but some of the branches that kind of are famous, I guess, for the Boston and Maine, a lot of them were in New Hampshire. So you had a line called the Hillsborough Branch, which is still called the Hillsborough Branch, which it gets complicated, but originally it was called the Manchester and Keene, but it never went to Manchester. It started in Nashua and went to Keene, and connected with a whole bunch of other lines in western New Hampshire. But by 1945, they had simplified things and diverted the line in a couple places, so it basically went from Nashua to Hillsborough, New Hampshire. And that's like your quintessential rural branch line. It had wooden covered bridges. It was lightweight rail, so you could only use locomotives of a certain weight and type on the line, like moguls, and then early in the 50s, small EMD and Alco switchers. Another branch which was pretty famous was the Claremont branch in the center of New Hampshire, which connected Concord, New Hampshire, the capital of New Hampshire, with Claremont, which is right on the border between New Hampshire and Vermont. Another Mogul Country branch that had covered bridges that went by Lake Sunapee, later became a home of an early forest preservation operation in the early 60s.
We'll get to that later.
Yep, so that's a pretty quintessential branch line. Then, for example, in rural Massachusetts, northeastern Massachusetts, you had branches like the Essex branch, which was a dead-ended branch which almost always played host to 440 American-type steam locomotives into the 1930s and 40s, which was pretty antiquated by that point. And that's an example of a line that was always dead-end, never went anywhere else, and so that had three-stall roundhouse and an Armstrong turntable and all your little basic branch line accoutrements at the very end of it. So you had a lot of variety on the B&M when it came to branch lines, and all the operations were pretty unique. Some of them had turntables, some of them ran tender first back to their origin point, some of them had interchange points with other railroads and other branch lines, some of them were just a couple customers, a couple of them served giant paper mills and they had a lot of traffic. Some of them had passenger service into the 50s, some of them didn't. So yeah, basically you roll the dice and see what you come up with.
I love that. And that's, you bring up the tender first operations, and it reminds me of some stories from my railroad, the Valley, the dreaded New Haven for those folks following along at home. But a thing I constantly see in the railroader community and RO and other train gangs is the complaint of not having the ability to turn your engine around at the end, and that's just such a normal thing on the East Coast.
Yeah.
I think it may have been different on the West, but like the East Coasters I know are like, my branch line, like my tourist railroad that I work for, like speaking broadly like Milo, but like it didn't have a turntable, didn't have a Y, so they had to run tender first for 15 miles to get to the closest one where it met off the main line, and then Y there. For the longest time, that's how the Valley line ran. They had a local come out of, and Chris, please correct me on the yard it came out of, but it was on the shoreline, right?
So there was actually two. Eventually, the valley would have been split in half and serviced by one local leaving out of Hartford and heading down, and one leaving out of New London that would service up the valley. So it would run along the shoreline, go halfway up the valley, turn around, and then when it got back to Old Saybrook, continue on to Cedar Hill.
So that's how it worked. But
Yeah.
from Goodspeed down, I believe it was you were tender first, and that's 15
Yep.
miles of tender first operation, which is, God, I cannot imagine trying to do that now.
I mean,
We do that
I
now.
think
We
the New Haven
do that now.
they put a J1 Mikado in the dirt doing that one
They
night.
did.
Yeah.
That is.
No,
They did run J1 Mikados as a local engine as well.
Nice.
Which is the reference to SY 3025. So
It's interesting that you mentioned, Chris, that truncation and the line being split up, and then you had locals, start out at one point and kind of go all over the place. On the B&M, were kind of known as roving locals, where you would have a local job that would start in, say, Concord, New Hampshire, and then run the main line to Manchester, the largest city in New Hampshire. And then one day of the week, they might go out one branch line. One day of the week, they might go out another branch line. So some of these lines were so infrequently served that you would have, once a week service with a dedicated local that was based entirely out of somewhere else. And it was just their job to go out there on a certain day. And because of that, you have some pretty unorthodox operations, like things like tender first operation or mixed train service with a passenger coach, or flying switches to reach customers and running cars by on other tracks and things like that. Once these lines became separated and segmented, you had to work with what you have, because you may not have an engine facility, or may not have a turntable, or you may not be able to access that switch going in the other direction. So yeah, you really kind of saw a lot of, and I think Nick has used this term before when we're talking about early preservation, but flying by the seat of your pants railroading. And I think a lot of branch line operations kind of follows that mantra.
You did hit that on the head, and if I may elaborate, the local, at least we're talking during a certain time frame on the New Haven, that left at a Hartford would come down to Middletown, Connecticut, about halfway through its journey. And depending on if it was an even or odd day, meaning every other day, they would either continue down to East Haddam / Goodspeed and back all the way to Hartford, or they would forego going down the valley and actually go up another branch line to the town of Berlin, Connecticut, and service industries on that line.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I'm thinking about that. Like, be an interesting way to run a railroader save, is this roving.
Yeah.
Like, one day you're doing stuff this way, the next day you're running this line, and an engine is just assigned and rotated out through each op session. That could be a fun way to play.
Yeah, that's the beauty of railroader, is you could have a local based out of Bryson. You could write your own lore, and have this crew, maybe the Alarka branch at one point, you could pretend it went somewhere else and it became a dead end branch, and that's like your Wednesday job, and then if you play on Wednesday, you do the Alarka branch, and then another day you go to a different place or something like that. It allows a lot of basis of like video game on real life operations, which is so
Yeah.
cool.
Huh.
That's something that I've discovered through some of the designs that I've created for Great Train Layouts Live, where Train Z as a software at this point doesn't really have a robust multiplayer. So for all intents and purposes, if you're playing it as a single player experience. So when I choose track plans, I often choose ones where it's entertaining enough to work as a single person experience. So maybe the layout could accommodate multiple trains operating at once, but it also can just be run as sort of a stepped sequence of one session or one run is one direction, and one session and then another session is another direction. One session is yard switching, where if you had multiple people at once, you could do that all at the same time. But by pretending it's just kind of a lower capacity network at whatever time you're modeling, then it doesn't make you feel like you're all alone in this world that you've built.
Yeah, when I had a switching layout HO scale, I would, play on a Monday, and I'd take cars out to the industries, and then I'd wait till the end of the week and I'd go pick them up and swap them out with other cars and kind of pretend that I was doing, real life operations based on this small space. But you can get a lot out of it if you know how to play it right, for sure.
Yeah. God, that's. Well, I gotta rethink my model railroad that I want to build now.
Yeah. The backstory is the fun part.
The backstory is the fun part. Are we good there to kick Nick?
We're good. Yeah, you can kick now. Keep coming, keep coming. Okay, good.
On the note of kicking, and you mentioned flying switches with one of the branches earlier. If you guys haven't seen the B&M flying switch video on YouTube,
oh yeah,
I will put it in the VRA Discord after the stream. But
yep.
Anytime anyone asks me what a flying switch is, that is my go-to video. It's a 10-wheeler trailer mogul with like a.
It's on the Essex branch.
Isn't it?
It's a mogul.
It's a mogul with a, I don't know, like 6-7 passenger cars, and they do a flying switch and get the engine onto the other end. Loaded passenger train. It is hilarious.
Yeah, that was a I think that was a picnic, an employee picnic train, or some company chartered a picnic run. I think that is on the Essex branch, yeah. Which basically, there you go. It's just kind of like, that was run-of-the-mill stuff. I mean, a lot of these branch lines, in addition to having kind of unique weekly freight and maybe mixed train rolls, also saw a lot of excursion and kind of unusual moves as well, which is something you could also recreate in Railroader if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's not a thing to discount. My railroad, the Susquehanna, it was the annual company picnic train was a massive thing. They'd gather up every passenger car they had on the railroad and take it out to a picnic, and that's, well, a unique thing to simulate, preserve, represent, pick your adjective for bringing that into your railroader world, your model railroad world, your research world for your favorite railroad. It's cool. It's a cool thing that goes back eons. Not eons, but you know.
A long time.
A long time.
Yeah,
there's a lot of historical precedent for it, which is cool.
Casey, if I may add on to that.
Yes.
Another story that we like to tell our guests, especially when you are, where I am the caboose host on our line, and I'm telling people about what caboose were used for. One of the stories I like to tell is there were, the railroads are for leaving my head at the moment, but the railroads that didn't have a lot of money and maybe couldn't buy like an observation or a business card and try to wheel and deal either clients or vendors that were along their line, they would sometimes trick out a caboose and have it be like a back home cooked meal, country style dinner aboard the caboose, because they were, hey, we're your local neighbor, we're helping you out, we're not the big railroad, we're one of you, we live with you, we service you, and it was kind of a more hometown feeling with the railroads, especially ones on branches.
Mm-hmm. There's so many stories. I've talked about a million times the book Set Up Running of, tossing.
Sorry to interrupt, Casey.
Sorry.
Somebody reports that your audio is a little low.
Oh, I've turned up. Is that better for everyone over there? Hopefully it is.
Well,
Let me know if it
your
isn't.
story, yes.
But during the Depression on the branch, chucking coal off the side of the engine as you're going by to help people out for their home eating. It's not a small thing, but like those kinds of like branch line stories, I guess you can call them, of like how the railroad interacted with the community and became a part of it. Yeah.
There's a book that was written in 1950, I believe. It's called High Green and the Bark Peelers. And if you know anything about the Boston and Maine, this is your summer reading, if you're interested in the topic. It was written by a Midwestern college professor who was interested in railroading, and he was riding a passenger train in the Midwest and happened to meet Boston and Maine engineer who was going on a cross-country trip with his wife. And through that meeting, the professor ended up getting permission from the Boston and Maine management to tour the B&M, and he wrote his experiences into that book. And it's pretty short, and maybe it's 150, 200 pages, but he rides mainline trains, he rides a switcher, he rides a train up to North Conway, I believe, and one chapter he rides the head end of the 1455, which is the B&M Mogul, which is preserved at Danbury Railway Museum. And he rides that local on the Hillsborough branch out of Nashua. And that whole chapter is about branch line railroading, and it's about how here's a branch line that once served a greater area and was more important, and by 1950 a lot of people questioned why it exists, but by the end of that chapter you kind of understand why that branch line still exists, because they stop at a town and they're unloading Halloween paper cups and garden hoses and shovels and wheelbarrows, and there's a fire truck that's going to be delivered the next day to this town. And he just goes through all the different things that they're carrying for these towns, less than carload freight, which just kind of really
the bread and butter
illustrates how
of the branch
yeah, it
line
just
is
really
the
illustrates
LCL.
exactly, and it just kind of that answers the question as to why does this line still exist. And the funny thing is even though that LCL is long gone and railroads don't carry that kind of stuff to small towns around here anymore, the branch line is still around today. It hasn't been abandoned. So 50 years later, 60, 70 years later, that line is still existing. So yeah, if you get a chance to find it, it should be pretty easy to, if you're in New England. I think a lot of libraries carry it because the B&M as a marketing tool gave a copy of that book to every town that they served.
Oh, that's awesome.
But I think there's a lot available on Amazon and stuff too. And I can probably, I think I have it in PDF form, so I could always rip those pages and send them to you if anybody wants to read that chapter specifically.
I'm certainly going to try and find a hard copy, but if you have a version that's shareable for people who don't have access to a hard copy, I think the community would appreciate that. Nick, I do notice we have a meet coming up here at Alarka Junction. We've got one of the passenger trains off the branch is coming at us.
So I see that.
But yeah, and we started touching on this earlier, but the different kinds of branch line operations, and we talked about the B&Ms around Robin style, I think you called it, Rick.
And roving local, round robin.
The roving local, the weight restrictions, and the different types of ways of you can run it. And I kind of wanted to touch on like what we're doing tonight with. We're starting in a bigger yard, and you have to travel the main to get to the main line, so to speak, to even make it to your branch, which is right, wrong, otherwise. There's multiple ways to do it. And I'm sure everyone can spit out numerous examples of how their local railroad did it, and we started here in this small yard where the local on the main line dropped off cars to the local on the branch line, and there's what is it the saying, 1,000 ways to skin a cat. But that's just wanted to dive more into those different types of operations as we wait here, as we continue our switching and all of that.
Well, they were waiting for us up at Cochrane.
They're waiting for us?
Yeah, they weren't moving at all. So, look, it seems like we can go by them.
They just departed the station, according to AI.
Oh.
Okay.
Can we stop them?
I'm on it.
Okay. Then I will keep going. On the note of Mogul country. So yeah, we were talking about the different types of operations that how the B&M was breaking up different power and the kind of idiosyncrasies of the operation style.
Yeah. Later on in the branch line, period. You started to see some interesting things. Um, Initially, the Boston and Maine was pretty well known for having, dedicated power on branch lines, and so you might have a specific mogul that was on the Hillsborough branch for a couple of years, or you might have, that kind of thing. But in the diesel era, you saw a lot more power being pooled around in different places, and after the bankruptcy in 1970, uh, the rules just went out the window completely. The only time we really saw locomotives strictly being used on branch lines is if they were lightweight. If they had like light rail or a light bridge or something, then you would probably see like an SW1 or an Alco switcher. But a lot of the branch lines into the 70s and 80s, you would see a whole variety of power on these lines. And one of the reasons for that is you had these locals that were roving locals that were based out of like Concord, New Hampshire, for example. So you might have a road freight from East Deerfield, Massachusetts to Concord, New Hampshire that might come into town with 3 GP9s and a GP38. And the power would be taken off the main line train and brought to the terminal. And then the local freight, which was based out of that town, would take one of those locomotives and use it on the local freight. And so for reasons like that, you might see a brand new GP38-2, which was bought by the B&M in 1974, on a rural branch line in 1975. Brand new road power on the local freight. And same thing when the GP40-2 showed up in 1978. Some of these lightweight branch lines that had like 2 or 3 customers, you'd see a brand new GP40-2 on those tracks, which could lead to problems with deferred maintenance and things like that. But yeah, that was kind of a unique thing. Yeah, exactly. There was one instance, I think, where they were running on a branch with a 40-2, and I think they went on the ground like 4 times or something.
Oh my god.
So, but yeah, that's one way that some of these weird locomotives would show up in the unlikeliest of places.
The dedicated power in the steam era is surprising that lasted until, you said, through the steam era, right?
Yeah, not so much like this locomotive was always used in this location, but more so like types of locomotives.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was like
a
a special Boston. I mean, because I know, like, from my research of the railroads I enjoy, it like that like assigned very specific power went away by the turn of the century, by the teams.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure if like the B&M was different in that regard there, or if it was or how they worked that.
They did have locomotives assigned to divisions. So you'd have locomotives that were New Hampshire division locomotives, and you'd have locomotives that were, terminal division based out of Boston or Portland division. So yeah, you did have locomotive numbers that were pretty much only used on certain divisions, and they didn't stray too far. So like for that example, like 1455 was I believe was a New Hampshire division locomotive, so it was on branch lines in New Hampshire quite a bit, and so there's a lot of photographs of it in New Hampshire. So yeah, you did have terminal locomotives. That pretty much went away at the end of the steam era. I do believe that there were switcher locomotives that were based in certain locations, like Alcos would have been more commonly seen on the west end of the B&M than the eastern end.
Interesting.
Because of terminal facilities and things like that, various mechanics knowing the internals of those locomotives. But yeah, it wasn't as strict as it might have been earlier on.
That's kind of fascinating. I hadn't thought of ever the breakup of these, this terminal is like an Alco terminal, this terminal is an EMD terminal. That possibility had never crossed my mind before.
Yeah, with the switchers too, on the B&M, there is some rule and rhyme to the diesel switchers. The handrails, the color of the handrails. If the end handrails are white, I believe they were painted that way in Boston. And if the end handrails are yellow, I think that was done in Mechanicville, New York. So for some reason, they painted the handrails different colors in different places. So If you look at a switcher with white handrails, that was probably based out of the eastern end of Massachusetts more frequently than the western end. But when the bankruptcy comes around, wherever they need an engine is where it ends up. So kind of interesting.
My Boston and Maine numbered Fs in Railroader have yellow handrails. They're New York, baby. Woo!
There you go. Yep.
Little victories for the state, for my home state. Now, and you and I texted about this briefly when we were setting this up, but New England industries on these branch lines, and I know a little bit from reading some of your published work and watching your videos. Very shameless plug on the B&M Historical Society channel. Go watch those videos. But what kept these branches alive industry-wise? Because I know a little bit about the paper mills, the quarries, and the Claremont and Concord, and the milk trains with the Rutland. But outside of that, I don't know a lot about what were the mainstay industries of a lot of these branches, or this region.
Yeah, good question for sure. The survival of the branch lines is kind of a case-by-case basis. In New Hampshire, especially in the White Mountains, a lot of paper mills, paper companies. A lot of those paper companies were pretty strong and healthy in the 60s and 70s, so a lot of those branch lines stayed intact for the most part into that period of time. Other lines, it kind of depends on a lot of factors. There was a branch line called the Portsmouth Branch, which ran from Manchester, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, from the center of the state to the seacoast. And that didn't have any large customers on the line, but there was a lot of oil traffic, bunker sea oil, that came into Portsmouth by ship and then traveled in tank cars hot, because bunker sea fuel oil is shipped hot. So they were basically hot cars. And that fuel oil was used in paper mills and also by fuel dealers. And so that was a vital lifeline from the seacoast to the center of New Hampshire. And then those tanker cars would be distributed to various paper mills and places. Once that traffic went away in the mid to late 60s, you basically have a 30-mile branch line with maybe 7 online customers.
Wow.
And so it depends on how healthy the customers are. It depends on whether or not there's vital traffic flowing over these branch lines. And once the B&M goes bankrupt in 1970, they essentially have a lot of branch lines which maybe at one time had a big customer, maybe at one time had vital traffic flowing on it. That traffic has either gone to trucks or gone out of business, and so now you have the B&M bankrupt, stuck with a lot of 15, 20, 25-mile branch lines with like feed dealers and maybe like 1 or 2 companies located on those lines. And so it becomes an economics thing. I mean, you have a bankrupt railroad that is, not able to maintain its track, so you're having derailments and things like that more common. You're running 30 miles, paying a 5-man crew with a caboose to, bring 1 or 2 loads from an urban center to a rural location. So some of those lines, eventually the B&M decided in the 70s it wasn't worth keeping them in operation. But other lines with paper mills, large companies, were bringing in more money. The other thing that the B&M started to do as early as the 50s was to sell off some of these branch lines which weren't profitable to other ventures. They sold them to state governments. They sold them to private owners. You see the rise of independent shortline companies on some of these branch lines that the B&M parts with. And then in the early 60s, you start to see the rise of tourist passenger trains on some of these rural branch lines that the B&M just couldn't justify serving any longer. They were just losing too much money. So the survival of these lines is a case-by-case basis, but a lot of them just up and died, and they couldn't find any use for them. So yeah.
I, on the note of the rise of the short line towards the end of the branch line era, I think of how many branches from different railroads ended up getting consolidated under one new short line, and like the Green Mountains, what is that? That's the B&M, the Rutland, Central Vermont tracks, all kind of merged under one new banner, and they were all. I mean, one of them, the Rutland, was a main line. That was their main line, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Green Mountain.
Yeah,
it was Rutland. Yep.
Yeah, that was Rutland's main line, but Central Vermont and the B&M, those were the branches in the area, and these branches became a big thing of its own in a whole new light, and I think that's cool and unique of how they started out as these independent companies and then merged and then splintered back out into re-merged independent companies of pawned off branch lines.
Yeah.
Not dissimilar to what you're seeing now with like NS getting rid of their locals.
Yeah.
Time is a circle.
Yeah, you see a lot of in the 50s and 60s in New England. You see kind of a battle of identity, of retention between state government, private railroad companies, and the local population, all kind of pulling in different directions. And it sort of touches a lot of different angles, but it touches sentimentality, it touches economics, it touches culture and society, it touches private enterprise, and it touches government body in some ways. I mean, you see these towns fighting to keep their railroads and fighting to keep the image of railroading in their communities. You see customers like Merrimack Farmers Exchange in New Hampshire begging the Boston and Maine to give them cross ties so they can fix their own track, because the Boston and Maine refused to go in and fix derailments because they just weren't making any money and they needed their freight cars at this customer. You see state governments pleading with the Boston and Maine not to cancel service, fighting to keep these rural branch lines alive. Nowadays, you think of the state of New Hampshire, abandoning railroads wherever they can, but back then they were fighting to keep them running. You see people like Nelson Blount and other private individuals coming in and trying to save what they can with tourism. It really is. I mean, you could make a wonderful human period piece just about, and I guess kind of there are movies about it, but it really goes deeper into the fabric of everyday life in New England when it comes to some of these branch lines, because it just goes in so many directions.
Yeah. It's I lost my train of thought while I was thinking about the switching moves I needed to do.
Yeah, there were some runaways in some of these branches too. So they
We
lost
love a
their
good
train
runaway
quite a
story.
bit. Yeah.
All right.
So, one of my favorite B&M branches, partially because it's one that I've built a train layout of based on a mutual friend, is the Cheshire Branch. I think what's interesting about that one to me is that despite it being a branch, it actually was quite a major artery of the railroad itself. But
yeah, for sure.
I think the thing that would be surprising for most to learn is that despite it being a branch line, it hosted the Flying Yankee for a period of time in service.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. The Cheshire. It was actually, I believe, when the 6000 operated on that branch from Boston to White River Junction, I think. They called it the Cheshire, and they had a specific nameplate for it.
Oh, cool.
So that train set kind of changed names depending on where it was operated. But I think the Cheshire was one of its last long-term assignments. Yeah.
Alright, train is now in your control, Nick. I've already made the first cut.
All right, then
We're gonna double over this first half.
All right, hold on. Let me just. It was already
I was trying to remember why I remembered the Cheshire Branch, and then I remembered. I feel embarrassed now of forgetting about it completely.
Well, there was that, and Ben also knows somebody. The guy we both know knows a guy who models the Cheshire Branch, so he's probably talked to you about it like 6,000 times.
No, I read a book about the Cheshire Branch, or at least
okay.
part of the Cheshire Branch. Briefly on the Cheshire Branch, right? Maybe I'm misremembering. I don't know.
No, the Cheshire was where
60,
the Monadnock
62.
Northern ran in 62. Yep.
Yeah,
The Cheshire is interesting.
I was just reading
go ahead,
that book again the other day, and not in prep, but cause I needed. Someone was talking to me about something about Steamtown, and I was like, oh hey, hang on, no, there's a book for this, and then naturally got wrapped up in rereading the whole book. But the Cheshire Branch, interesting, please.
Yeah. So that was, as Nick had kind of alluded to, that was a through route between western Massachusetts and eastern Vermont, Bellows Falls, and South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, cutting across the southwestern corner of New Hampshire. And the Cheshire was, for all intents and purposes, pretty much a mainline railroad in its construction. It was heavily signaled with semaphore signals. It was constructed to a T. You had these huge fills and giant arch bridges, stone arch bridges. It served Keene, New Hampshire, which was, a relatively large metropolitan center for New Hampshire standards, which had two other railroad lines that left the city, so kind of a railroad center. It was an important connection between western Massachusetts and the Rutland Railroad in eastern Vermont. And once the Rutland goes out of business in the early 60s, a lot of that traffic just kind of dries up. And the Cheshire basically goes from a mainline railroad in the late 50s with streamlined passenger trains and milk trains and local freights to the mid 1960s, where you have a couple time a week local freight and high and wide moves, extra unusual special moves, and that's it in about 10 years. So the Cheshire is an interesting case study of how some of these branch lines were kind of high profile. They weren't all little dinky branch lines in the middle of the woods, but pretty soon once situations change, then it doesn't take that long for things to kind of deteriorate. But the Cheshire's role in the Steamtown story is a good example of how preservation did save some of these lines, but unfortunately in the Cheshire's case it wasn't permanent. So
the Cheshire is the fate of the Cheshire is kind of a sad story.
For sure, yeah.
And that it's so close to being saved, and just it didn't happen. All right, Nick, I just want to reorder these cars. That way mine 1 is up against the engine, and mine 2 is at the back.
Got it.
And then we can head up the mine branch. But
Train 200.
Oh, sorry.
Train 200 to BR2. Be aware, 200 is on the branch.
All right. We are working in the yard, but we'll be out of your way here very shortly. I cut that off too soon. Again, book I've talked about 1,000 times. If we really got to start an official book club one of these days with how much we recommend people read and good stories. But reading set up running. The main branch that OP runs on, up to Southport, New York, is it's a branch line and they're double heading IS1s on, 100-car coal tracks. But it's a branch line, and a branch line doesn't always have to be what you think a branch line can be. A branch line can be a heavy rail line and moving a ton of cargo, because that's what it's there for. But it's not enough to be considered a major line like the Northeast Corridor would be.
Yeah, purposeful. The branch lines were all purposeful, and the purpose of them is as varied as the lines themselves.
All right, fair enough, Nick. I hope that works. All right, fair enough.
So to bring a little southern hospitality to the conversation, a local branch line to me that's really kind of out there for itself was the Baltimore and Ohio had a branch line that was from my hometown in Lexington about 50 miles north, and it was completely isolated from everything else on the B&O. They were captive to the Southern.
What?
Yep. One of those weird things where one line acquired another, and so here was this completely isolated branch line that the Southern did not like having existing, and so it folded in the 40s.
Completely isolated.
Completely isolated from the rest of the B&O network.
How did that work?
Well, just whenever they needed to shop power, they just transferred over Southern and just interchanged with the Southern.
That's amazing.
But it was a bit. But perhaps the most famous branch, which isn't super close to me, but known for the photography of, or as a photo hotspot for one Winston Link, was the Abingdon branch.
Oh, God, yeah. If you don't think branch lines, if you think branch lines in Abington isn't one of the first ones that comes to mind. Right.
So
I was gonna say, let me get this handbrake off and let's head up to the first mine.
So the Abingdon is a case of a branch line having antiquated power in the form of the Norfolk and Western's M-class locomotives because of bridge weight restrictions, as Rick mentioned earlier. And so had a single mixed train by the 50s that was running round trip from Bristol on the Tennessee-Virginia border up the Radford Division by about 10 miles to Abingdon, at which point it diverged onto that branch and ran for another 60 odd miles to Jefferson, or West Jefferson, North Carolina. And so yes, when Winston Link was doing his photo documenting of the NNW in the 50s, it was one of the only places at which he took photos during the day because there were no night operations on the branch.
You know, I
Uh,
never connected the dots on that one until just now.
Don't worry, it's not the first thing that comes to mind. But honestly, as amazing as his technical work at night is, his day stuff on the Abingdon is my favorite because I think it's his strongest human interest work. Because yes, he had human interest even with the night shots, but there's a little bit more of a photojournalism element to the Abingdon stuff, where you're seeing like the conductor sleeping on the return trip, and you're seeing the kids running up at one of the stations to the conductor because the conductor would give out lollipops to the kids. And that's like, you can tell like that's the real deal entirely. Whereas is a little less constructed than some of Link's other work.
It's some of the best slice of life stuff there is out there, is his work from the Abington as well. Of like, you really get the sense of like, you're there in this like, almost, sometimes candid, sometimes posed moment of someone's life, and that, I don't know, to me that speaks to like, what branch lines are all about, is that rural, out there America and just, you have this thread of the railroad connecting you to everything.
So my book recommendation time.
We're gonna stop when you clear here and shove the
shove
upper
the
cars
two?
up. Yeah.
Got it.
No, I just
Okay.
want to ditch the cars so we're not dragging them around
Oh, fair
while
enough.
we work one. All right, you're clear to shove.
So my book recommendation is going to be The Last Steam Railroad in America by Link and Thomas Garver, who was longtime assistant of his. Because you can get it dirt cheap. There's copies all over the place, so you can get them very easily, probably 10 or 15 bucks. And that one has a very large section on Abingdon photos.
This
there's
is
another
the night for book recommendations.
Yes. There is another one that I have to quickly search the name of, because I'm spacing on the name of it. And that has some Abingdon stuff. Steam, Steel, and Stars. And honestly, also
one.
super common and also super easy to get. So you really should have both. But I think Last Team Railroad in America, going off of memory, has more Abingdon stuff.
Selling point on Steam, Steel, and Stars, that one has, at least when I bought it, it came with a CD. So if you like Link's audio recordings, you can get it on CD, and
I think you're mistaking that.
Filed.
I think you're mistaking that with the Tony Reevy book.
No, am I? No, I have Steam, Steel, and Stars.
Oh,
Is that...
so there's a third book that Tony Reevy published in the early 2000s, which is Life Along the Line. And that's the one that I'm familiar with having a CD.
Interesting.
Maybe you're... I have to check my copy.
Maybe two of them. I looked over at my bookshelf, because, spoiler alert, Train Nerd, who also has a book collection. They go hand in hand, apparently. No one told me when I signed up to like trains that I would also become a book collector. But the bookshelf behind me doesn't have it, so I'll have to find it later and look. Plus, now I'm curious.
The Tony Reevy book, I mean, all three are worth having. The Tony Reevy book is ironically a bit more rare, so be prepared to kind of wait out on eBay to see that come up, and that somewhere between 60 and 90 for that. So more expensive of a book, but I will also observe, I do not own that book, but I read it because I got it through my local library's interlibrary loan program. So you can always do that as a thing too if you're trying to get an obscure book and don't want to pay out the nose for it.
I guess I will add my 2 cents into this. It's not a book. It is actually an article featured in the New Haven Society's quarterly magazine You'd have to find a back issue. I'm trying to see if it's online so I could add that to your links, Casey, but it is called Memories of the New Haven's Valley Branch. And it is narrated by a gentleman called John Wallace, who grew up in Weathersfield along the branch. And it depicts one day of operation from dusk till dawn. Um, Tagging along as a teenager, the engineer and the fireman let him go up in the cab and tag along for a day, and he
That's awesome.
chronologues the entire day of the Valley local branch and what that crew did.
If you guys are a member of a historical society, check out their magazine archives. Costs. I was just going through the Susquehanna Tech Societies recently, and that's bleeding your ear out the back. And aside from finding a phenomenal series of articles detailing the purchase, shipping, and sinking of Susquehanna 141, and the painting of 142 into 142, but there's so many articles that the society did on. Yeah, we're gonna shove back Nick, then couple up to our cut and shove it ahead. Okay.
Got it.
So many articles of like different guys riding along on the branch lines, and Susquehanna was all main line. A couple of branches, but it was all main line, and it was a lot of locals, of just following the locals. And so many societies have these articles in their magazines, and they're seriously diamonds in the rough. And take the time, ply through the archives, and see what goodies are in there. You'll find such interesting stuff.
Now, getting back to the Boston and Maine side of things, we would be remiss if we weren't to talk about a certain diesel locomotive numbered 1127.
Yeah.
So, Rick, you can fill us in on the details of the significance and the current plight of that locomotive.
Yeah, that's a great case study for basically everything from the 1950s onwards, at least in New England. We had mentioned that a lot of these branch lines in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts and other places were kind of a product of their time, especially having been built in the 1800s. And a lot of that infrastructure doesn't change in New England. You don't have the economics behind it. And so as the 1950s roll around, a lot of these branch lines have lightweight rail. They've got wooden covered bridges or wooden pile trestles, or smaller steel bridges. And so the infrastructure itself that's connecting these large cities for New England with some of these small town outposts are basically outdated. And so you might have Merrimack Farmers Exchange in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and they need rail service. Because it's more economical for them to get a 40-foot boxcar feed once a week than to get trucks multiple times a week. And so you have to get that boxcar from Nashua, New Hampshire to Hillsborough, New Hampshire. But these are lightweight rails, in some places their maintenance is kind of fallen by the wayside because of the economics of the area. So you need a certain type of locomotive to serve that industry. And the EMD-SW1, which came around in the late 1930s, was one of the most useful tools for the railroad in New England and for the Boston and Maine, because it was basically a Swiss Army knife locomotive. It was good for terminal switching. It was good for switching milk cars and passenger cars and mail cars. It was good for serving all of your urban customers, all of your, customers that are down street running track or in the side of an alleyway or has a tight curve going into it, because the SW1 is a pretty small diesel. It has a pretty small wheelbase, so it can go around tight curves. But it's also a lightweight locomotive, so it's perfect for these rural branch lines that, never saw major infrastructure upgrades. And so the SW1 becomes the replacement for the mogul in a lot of these places, including, New Hampshire, mogul country. And the SW1 is basically photographed on these branch lines from the early 1950s to the early 1980s. And 1127 was one of the Boston and Maine's second phase SW1s. The B&M ordered some SW1s in the late 1930s, and then they ordered some again in the early to mid 1950s, and the 1127 was of that second batch. And it started its life switching the massive network of tracks that was Boston, switching the freight yards and the passenger terminals in Boston, but eventually found its way into freight service in New Hampshire. And the 1127 became kind of the unsung hero of a lot of these branch lines. It is photographed probably more than any other SW1. It spends almost a decade based out of Concord, New Hampshire, switching the yard in Concord and also running the branch lines in the Concord area, running up the White Mountain branch from Concord, New Hampshire, up to the Lake Sunapee, Winnipesaukee, rather, region of New Hampshire, and switching in and around Lake Winnipesaukee. It also spends a lot of time on the Hillsborough branch. It spends some time in Manchester, New Hampshire. So it bounces around a lot, and it becomes kind of the symbol of what railroading was to these small towns from the 1950s to the 1980s. Your once a week local freight that's coming into town is pulled by the 1127. And so it's a representative of not only the necessity for this type of locomotive to keep the economic wheels turning for the railroad in New England, but also kind of the corporate representation, sort of the mascot of the Boston and Maine in some of these places. So it's a very, very unique locomotive. And that's not even to mention that it's the only SW1 that Boston and Maine had that was outfitted with multiple unit control, which allowed it to be operated in conjunction with other diesel locomotives. So the B&M retrofitted that engine with MU capability so that on the White Mountain branch out of Concord, you could start your day with a 50-car freight train headed to the paper mills in Lincoln, New Hampshire with a GP7. And then behind the GP7 was the 1127. And then you would MU the two engines together so they could operate in tandem. And once they got to Laconia, New Hampshire, which is about the halfway point of the White Mountain branch, they would uncouple the SW1. And the SW1 would spend the day switching all the small little customers in the area, and the GP7 would take the rest of the freight up to the paper mill in Lincoln. So
That is
it was a very utilitarian machine. I mean, it really served a purpose, and the Boston and Maine, being a frugal Yankee railroad, they got their money's worth out of the 1127. And so when that engine was retired by the Boston and Maine and its successor, Guilford Transportation, and sold to the Luzerne Susquehanna Railroad in the Scranton area of Pennsylvania, it continued being useful until just a couple of years ago for them, until they got bought out by R.J. Corman. And it kind of became a, what's going to happen to this locomotive? And word on the street was that Corman was not interested in doing anything with the locomotive and that they were going to scrap it. And so, just like the Minuteman took up arms and marched to Concord, Massachusetts, the New England rail fans created a grassroots effort to fundraise the survival of the locomotive, and they raised $60,000 in a weekend to save it. So that was kind of a really cool tribute to the people that recognize the importance of this locomotive and the image of branch line railroading, which it represents, which is gone from a lot of people's lives in New England.
A wonderful story. I mean, it's so great to see that come together and all of these key partners with the Danbury Railroad Museum, Boston, Maine Historical Society, and who else am I leaving off of this triangle?
I think for big organizations, Danbury stepped up. The effort was started by a couple people here in New England. Connor Marr and Mike LeBouliere, a couple other people, got the fundraising started, and then they were searching for an organization to accept the locomotive into their collection because, we didn't have any place to bring the locomotive if we saved it. And Danbury Railway Museum, Alden Burns and some of the people there stepped in and decided that they were going to home the locomotive when it was saved. And so with that partnership, And then that group came to the B&M Historical Society and asked for an endorsement of sorts from sort of the academic side of things. And the board of directors of the B&M Historical Society wrote up a press release and donated some money towards the cause. And yeah, it just kind of the camps kind of aligned nicely in the nick of time. And there was a couple moments where it was looking close, and there were deadlines and things like that. But Danbury really stepped up to the plate. And as far as I understand, the locomotive is being prepped for movement. They have to do some work on the wheels and the journals and certain things to get it roadworthy over mainline railroads. But it's going to be on its way there within, an amount of time. Not sure exactly what their timeline is, but it's being prepped for movement as far as I understand. So yeah, pretty soon it'll be safe, and then we can talk about the fun things that you can do with it in preservation. So
I, I was trying to find this photo I remembered of the 1127 and why that one stuck out in my head, aside from this amazing movement and preservation. Back up to clear that switch, Nick. Let's grab the hoppers in front of us and the box, and we'll have to do a little bit of shuffle to get us around everything.
Okay.
And then I remembered the photo of the Turner's Fall branch with the golf course. And I was like,
oh yeah, yep.
that ridiculously famous photo, and why that stuck out in my head.
I think I can send that to you. I think I have it here somewhere.
Alright,
And
keep
I love
coming ahead
that even
slowly.
though the
Slow,
branch
slow,
no
slow.
longer exists.
Stop.
Yeah,
Are you on this-
it's not there anymore, but you
You're
can
on
see
the
the ties
switch.
from satellite view. Yeah.
Okay. Alright, we're gonna have to do this weird. Let's split the engines.
Okay.
You want to take 1455 and grab the hoppers and the boxcar, and then roll back into the clear on that kind of short runaround.
Yep. Can do.
And then I'll shove these back. I'll let you grab the boxcar, get everything on the runaround, run around the train, and then I'll pull
Yep,
these ahead
put
and
it back.
run back around, and we'll put ourselves together.
Sounds good. Yeah, I love that even though that doesn't exist anymore, that you can still Google Map the golf course and still see where the right of way was.
Yeah, it was a neat little line, but that was, I mean, it's a complicated history, but that was actually a New Haven line prior to the floods of 1936. The B&M had a line into Turner's Falls, but their line was affected so severely by the flooding that the B&M actually took over part of the New Haven's canal line. I think that was the northern end of the canal line into Turner's Falls, and through the use of a switchback out at East Deerfield Yard, we're serving that branch until 1980, 81, I think.
That's the branch where like the covered bridge washed away in that flood, right? Or
Probably,
previous flood?
yeah. There was a bridge over the Deerfield River. Yeah, the B&M lost their bridge, and that's why they couldn't run their own line into Turner's Falls. So with the proximity to East Deerfield, they just built a switchback out of the yard and ran the New Haven line into town.
The weird New Englandisms like that. I love it.
Oh yeah,
So,
it's probably worth talking a little bit about the tourist preservation movement too.
It
when we
is.
talk about
we should.
what happened to some of these lines.
Well, I'll let you kick that off, since literally wrote the book on the preservation era of the branch lines of the Boston and Maine.
Yeah,
I
we
picked
mentioned
that
we mentioned the survival of these lines, and sort of the case by case situation of which lines lasted and which one didn't. And it's kind of comes down to fate, but as these lines start to disappear in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, you see kind of nostalgia becoming a marketable commodity during that time period, partially because of the post-war world, and Americana becoming palpable, as the Cold War sets in and things like that. But nostalgia became a hot item, and railroading became associated pretty heavily with that as the steam engines began to disappear and sort of the old time feel of railroading began to go away. And in the 1930s, you saw the rise of railroad enthusiast groups that would go around and ride an excursion on a branch line a couple times a year. I think one of the very first railfan groups was the Railroad Enthusiasts group, which had their first run on the Hoosick Tunnel in Wilmington in 1934, I believe, and that was a New England branch line. So you start to see a lot of fondness for this old-time railroading here in the 30s. And by the 50s and 60s, it's become kind of a headwind, and people with sort of the means to do so start going after equipment and property that's at risk of being lost. And a lot of these are branch line locations. And so in the, one of the important case studies of this is F. Nelson Blount, who was probably one of the most important figures in North American railroading. And he and other people, started to have this desire to preserve something that was, in their eyes, disappearing rapidly. And so, as the railroads like the Boston and Maine, the New Haven, and other railroads started to dispose of railroad lines and equipment that was no longer profitable to them, some of these private individuals stepped in to buy them and continue to operate them. And so you see some lines become host to tourist railroads in the 1950s onwards. Lines like the Cheshire Branch of the Boston and Maine for a very brief period of time, the Claremont branch of the B&M, which was no longer the B&M, it was the Claremont Concord, which was an independent short line company that popped up in 1954. The Conway branch of the Boston and Maine became the Conway Scenic. The Wolfboro branch of the Boston and Maine became the Wolfboro Railroad. And eventually parts of the Mountain Division, the Maine Central, became part of Conway Scenic. So some of these lines, which no longer became desirable for, quote unquote, real revenue railroading, became desirable in a different light to serve a different purpose, which was tourism and preservation of railroading. And so, thankfully, a good number of branch lines survived to be used to that end, thanks to people that had money and means to kind of do that. So, the Steamtown story, which starts very tied into the Boston and Maine and New England railroading, and other tourist railroads kind of continue that trend. And I guess a related link here, Conway Scenic Railroad is celebrating its 50th anniversary this August. And that's another situation where you had a branch line which served a very scenic place that was no longer profitable for the Boston and Maine to operate. And a concerned group of individuals rallied around it, railroaders, business people, local townsfolk, and ended up creating something that lasts to this day and that has survived, long out-survived the Boston and Maine's useful purpose for it, and continues to grow and evolve in the modern era. And there's going to be an article in Railfan and Railroad magazine in August, which is going to detail the 50th anniversary of the Conway Scenic and sort of the story of how that whole thing got started, sort of an uphill battle by these concerned individuals to save that operation. So tying into the preservation movement and branch line railroading, that'll be a good thing to look out for in the next few months.
Oh, that's yeah, I gotta keep an eye out for that. That's
Yeah.
I didn't realize they were hitting their 50th. That's
Yeah.
Well,
oh, and that's a lot of tourist railroads in the New England area are hitting their 50th.
Yeah. Yep.
And like,
When did
Chris,
Valley
was
get
ours?
started? Yeah.
2020? 2021 was our
2021.
50th?
2021.
Yeah, so
and
61 was our 50th then.
Yep.
Steamtown would have had their 50th year after us if they were still in New Hampshire.
Steamtown had its unofficial 60th last year because if you draw straws, it's
Yeah.
so confusing as to when they actually got started. Some people say, yeah, well, when they were running at Lake Sunapee, that's when it started, but that was the Monadnock Steamtown at Northern. That wasn't Steamtown, USA. The park itself first opened at North Walpole in 1963. So if you go by that date, last year was the 60th of Steamtown. And then, I mean, gosh, they left New England 40 years ago in 1984.
Wow.
So yeah, it's crazy to think about, but it's been a long road for sure.
Like Conway, there's not really, um, I don't know if I'd classify it as a true tourist railroad, but Clark's Trading Post just hit an anniversary as well.
Yeah,
One of the big, I
the-
forget it was of a 10-year or a 5-year one.
yeah, they got started in mid 50s, so they got out of the gate pretty quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll be there on Tuesday, I think. Hopefully getting a ride in the climax.
Take
so I'm looking
pictures of
forward
the
to that.
climax for me. That engine is drop dead beautiful.
Yeah, we're gonna do a video about the White Mountain logging, I think, for the YouTube channel. So
Oh, I'll
Neat.
keep an eye out for
Prepare.
that one.
Prepare to feel your bones rattling for a few days afterwards. I love climaxes. I grew up 40 minutes from
That's
Kfory.
right.
They are my favorite of the logging trinity, but a smooth ride they are not.
No,
yeah.
no.
No, no.
The railroad
Nick-
enthusiast doing the.
Nick, how do we
sorry.
want to do this? Cause we'll get these tied onto our train. We'll take 89 back with us and leave 1455 here. Do you need fuel and anything?
No, because most of it's downhill. So
Okay.
yeah, because
Do you,
we're good on fuel for 89.
Okay. Do we want to get paid extra to wire our engine, or should we go tender first?
We'll go. I feel like it's gonna be easier if we go tender first.
Cool, I'm fine with that. Alright, then let's roll down into the yard. I'll get our switches.
So the railroad enthusiasts are hitting their 90th anniversary this year as well.
Whoa.
Wow. Yep.
In the chat for this channel, there's a link and a photo of the van trip on the Hoot Toot and Whistle.
Oh, there we go. I am going. If you guys are in the VRA Discord, hashtag not a shameless plug. After the stream, I will be dropping all of these probably in the announcements or content notify channel, so you can see, view, and do all of the fun things.
There's I put a link to a drive folder in there, Casey. It's got copy of that chapter High Green that I mentioned, and has the full book in there too if anybody
Oh,
wants
yes.
to read the whole thing.
Yes, I'll be sure to share all of this out afterwards. Okay. Oh, looks like local yard crew here is finishing up their switching. So our outbounds are ready, so we can just we can put our train together and go, Nick.
Sounds good. Do you want me to just stop short so your gravity feed them down the one line, then we run around
Yeah,
and grab
we-
both of them?
Yeah. It's gonna be a
Alright,
little
then I'll-
interesting because we got a hack in the way, but we'll figure it out.
Well, that's why I was saying if you put them on one temporarily,
Yeah,
then we run
we can
around
double it
both.
over.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. You wanna? All right. I got us lined. You wanna release and we'll let it roll?
Yeah, I'll give you a little extra. Nudgy.
I'm gonna
And
go
where
right
do you
down where
want me
there's
to
an
drop?
angle cock and panic and open it when we get too close.
Where do you want me to drop 1455 then?
You wanna put it in front of the engine house on your way by?
Can do.
Yeah, it's all the anniversaries in New England have really been cropping up rather quickly. Are there any other big ones coming up? I don't think so.
That's
Nagataki
pretty
There's a-
was
much
75.
it.
Oh,
Yeah.
Nagi's
Oh,
getting
yeah.
close to something, right?
They are not celebrating necessarily their tourist operation. They're celebrating, I think, the Nagataka line itself. I think they're selling it as the 175th, kind of like how Valley did 150
Yeah.
and 50.
And jumping back to preservation, spinning off of Steamtown was a shoreline, the Green Mountain.
Oh yeah, actually,
it's,
that's
uh,
another anniversary this year, 60th. Yep.
Really? Jesus.
Yeah, in September they're going to be doing a little. They're going to be doing a celebration of that. I think they're going to do runs on the Green Mountain line with the 405, the RS1.
Oh, nice.
The last weekend in September, I think. There's going to be some sort of gathering at Chester. So I may have a table there with some Steamtown stuff. But yeah, they're having their anniversary this year, 64. Yep,
Oh, cool.
1964. Which that's a whole nother story, the Green Mountain. But another example of concerned individuals filling the void once the major railroads, for one reason or another, can't continue service.
Do you need me to get an engine, Nick, or do you have both of them?
I 55. I've got
Oh,
89.
okay. Okay, I'll go stand over here by Hoppers then. Yeah, it's just New England has just. I don't want to call it railroady stories, but it feels so quintessential in a way of how they
Yeah.
rose, how they fell, how they came out of the ashes of the 70s and 80s and 90s.
It has a completeness to it. You have the origin stories, which in that link that I sent you, there's a full copy of a book called The Boston Concord and Montreal, which highlights the very early building of the railroads in New England. So you have the nexus, you have the birth of these things, and then you have the transformation over the next 75 to 100 years. And then you have the demise in some places, you have the resurrection and the rebirth. So it does have kind of a full, complete arc to it that other places in the country, certainly have in other ways. But yeah, it just it has an oldness to it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's because New England in general has sort of a longer history than some other places in terms of industrialism and stuff like that. But yeah, it does have that kind of vibe.
Yeah,
It may be being biased, but it certainly does. Yeah.
Oh, I'm definitely being biased. As a newfound fan, and I say this to my friends all the time, but I've been slowly converted to more and more of a New England rail fan from someone who's like New Jersey, New York, northern western Pennsylvania railroad area, and like just slowly gravitating more and more towards that uniqueness of what the story of New England railroading brings to the history of railroading. I'm very biased in that way, but
Yeah.
which is
yeah.
why
And
I
the other
wanted
thing-
to do this way tonight. But we get to
Right.
have fun.
Yeah, we do. We should celebrate it, I think, when we can. But the other thing that it brings to the table for people that are our age, of a certain generation, is, you can't. A lot of these lines you can't go out and see anymore. You can't rail fan. You can't take pictures of. You can't. We'll never see them in operation with our own eyes. But it brings to the table a mystery. It brings to the table like a discovery, I think.
Keep shoving, Nick. We have, if you can, we have the caboose still.
Oh, Sorry, I thought that was part of the package. Okay.
No, I was just going to check that.
Yeah, there's like there's a story out there to find, and you know it takes a lot of digging and it takes a lot of reading books and reading articles and looking at old photos and trying to ask questions and find answers when you can't go actually out and look at something yourself because it's gone. So yeah, there's that piece of it too, the detective work.
Yeah. Are you
know,
running back to Nick?
why
or
did they?
am I?
Your choice. You can
Yeah,
grab
you
it.
run. You sure?
All right. Yeah, I'll get it.
All right. I'll just hang out over here in this seat.
Double heading in reverse. Nice. Yeah, there's a lot of questions to be answered. Like, you know, why did they run tender first in a certain place? Why did they do any of these things? And you know, it's
Yeah.
getting harder for us to answer those questions. You know, being younger people, but it's a motivation, I think, too.
It is,
which
and I
cool.
think there's some societies are luckier than others to have as well of preserved archives as the B&M and in a little bit the main central looped into your archives as
Yep.
well. So like it's extremely lucky that the B&M Society is fortunate in this way to be able to have all of this information.
Yeah, having
But
been
the
started
rest of
back when
it's
the B&M
trying
was
to-
still around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the rest of it is like
Yeah.
tracking down. And I've got friends who are love the wacky railroads of the wacky logging railroads, just the wacky stuff. I don't know how else to describe what they like, but like they're tracking down like, oh yeah, no, here's a scanned news article from 1914, and
Yeah.
it has a little bit about the railroad, and like the interview with the engineer is all that they have, and it's like, God, that's it's we're lucky in the Northeast in a way to have so much of the written information saved.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not to wax poetic too much, but I think we're lucky in general that people of our generation have this amateur academic interest. I mean, I read some of the conversations about the Colorado narrow gauge stuff that, you know, people like Heiss and other people are having about, oh, this engine was built, you know, in this year and it looks like this because of that and all this technical stuff. And you know, we're all of a certain age, but we all have this drive to preserve this knowledge, not because of a job or a profession, just because of a passion and an interest.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
and the level of academic preservation that everyday people are doing with scanners and with video games and things like that. I mean, you look at games like this. You look at games like uh, you know, the even Railroads Online to some extent, and Century of Steam, which is coming out soon. And you know, these things aren't just games; it's historic preservation. You know, it may be a fictional operation, or it may be a fictionalized version of a real live branch line, but you're operating it in a way that people actually operated railroads centuries ago. And so that is historic preservation for sure.
yeah, and well, Nick and you and I have talked about this in the past in other streams, and I think yeah, you were in this one too, where we talked about getting involved, right, Rick, with
Yep.
California Matt and Heiss, and how video games have become a part of preservation, and it lets people tell stories and new and interesting ways, and not live out exactly what something was like, but getting to see it and touch it in a virtual space. Now the
Yeah.
engine we're running
That's
tonight,
fascinating.
it doesn't exist anymore. They were literally all scrapped, and here we are in a mogul built by American Locomotive Works, doing what it was doing virtually, and that's important.
Yep.
I do want to touch back on Steamtown as we're wrapping up, because I think that's such an I know it's a huge passion of yours, but the history in that of itself is, as we're talking preservation and virtual representation, that is a cornerstone of how we have gotten to where we are as a preservation society today.
Yeah.
And just kind of open it up to you to any other final thoughts you have as we're drifting back down the mountain and are Chris is telling me in chat that we're gonna have to hold in the hole at Cochrane for a meet, Nick. So
Yep.
just
Yeah.
a heads up. But yeah,
Yep.
the importance
Yeah,
of
Steamtown.
what Nelson did for where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from a personal perspective, growing up, Steamtown was a big name. It was a concept. I mean, it was such a complicated story, and I would get bits and pieces of it from VHS tapes and DVDs, and I would get glimpses into the story. But Steamtown, as that story unfolded, um, really is a case study for a lot of things. It's a case study for the time period. I mean, the 1960s is a decade of revolution, of change in a lot of different ways, and railroading is part of that. It's a case study of preserving a disappearing way of life. It's a case study for offering that to the general public, uh, offering what is your personal private collection to the general public for the greater purpose of education, and how that works and how difficult that can be when it comes to moving parts and government bodies and railroad companies. It's a case study for the steam preservation movement. It's one of the earliest stories of widespread steam preservation. It's one of the earliest stories of standard gauge steam preservation in New England, that's for sure, on the Boston and Maine. Um, and that story, as it unfolded, went from, yeah, it was a tourist railroad that ran a couple places in New Hampshire. Then they had a museum in Vermont for a couple decades, and now it's a national park in Pennsylvania. It went from that understanding of it to um, this was a passion project from a group of people that were concerned about something being lost forever, and this is how they went about doing it. And they failed a lot of the time. It didn't work. They had dreams that got dashed. They had plans that got ruined. Um, there were what ifs that could have happened and never did. There was a tragic plane crash where the founder of it all was killed. Um, you have people, famous people, coming out of the story, government people, politicians. Um, and so that the Steamtown story is really just a wonderful overarching look at preserving the story of railroading as it changed in America, and some of the people, the types of people that did that, and the equipment they did it with, and they were taking advantage of what they could, and so that kind of it was something that at first when I was thinking about documenting that story, um, I got concerned about specifics and how are we going to get bogged down in the details? Are we going to get bogged down in so much of the specificness of it that we're going to lose the greater picture? But I think the greater picture of that story is so hard to miss that um, eventually it just became so clear. So yeah, I mean, if you have any interest in New England railroading and in um, Steamtown, um, steamtown.org is sort of a free online archive database that I've started to kind of keep that story alive. There are timelines, there's photo archives, there's newspaper articles and railroad documents you can dig through that detail this fight, not only to preserve New England railroading, but to preserve the image of railroading in small towns and in the country as it changed. So yeah, definitely an interesting story. But I do want to stress that it's not a specific story to Steamtown. Steamtown
No,
is
such a broader
is a big
story.
part of it. But it's such a case study. I mean, you look at what Nelson was doing and what his associates were doing with Steamtown and the Monadnock Steamtown in northern and New England. And a lot of that you can copy and paste to the Conway Scenic and the Wolfboro Railroad and the Strasburg Railroad and the Durango and Silverton and the Cumbre and Toltec and all these other places. The spirit, at least, you can copy and paste. The specifics change, but I think the overarching spirit, it's important to understand that Steamtown can kind of be a symbol for it. It's not necessarily exclusive at all.
Yeah, it's a story of the period, and like you said, you can copy and paste it across the whole country of the kind of the big plot points, and
Yeah.
you see it in so many places that still exist today. Where they are, where they've come from, where they're going, their original idea, and everyone has an every tourist railroad has an F. Nelson plant.
Yep. Yeah.
It
And
is
the
it
success
is
and the failure comes down to the details, of course, but the spirit itself is definitely overarching. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, as a fun closure, and fear not, we are not abandoning the Alarka branch. The Monadnock Steamtown and Northern train is coming through.
The traveling circus, if you will.
You know, we thankfully someone put together an HO set and it was easy to copy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And fought the good fight of assembling Ambroid wood kits.
Oh boy, my fingers will never forgive me. Super glue.
Well, I don't know if there's anything more to say. I'm sure there's more to say on branch lines, but I think I'm out of stuff for the evening. I think we hit all of the important bits.
I would say so. But it has
Um,
been a wonderful conversation.
It really has. Rick, thanks for coming on. This was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed it. Always love waxing poetic about New England steam and chatting in general. So we will have to catch up in person again soon. It's been far too long.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'll have to join you guys some night for some operations.
Yes, it is always a hoot and a holler, with usually less crashing than we had at the start.
That's good. That's good.
But thank you everyone out there for joining in this evening for Branch Line Trains 200. Keep an eye out in the VRA Discord. If you need a link for that, down in the bio, there's a link tree. There's a link in there. I think the bot's broken for Twitch. So join there. A whole bunch of resources and books that we talked about tonight are going to get shared to there. Costs. That stuff is important. And if the VRA isn't anything educational, well, at least we're a good book club. But thank you all for joining in. Announcements about upcoming streams are coming out soon. We have a community night coming up. Nick and I we're finally booked our guest for our next stream, and that's going to be an awesome one. Nick and I are both very excited, so keep an eye out for that one as well. Rick, I can't say thank you enough for tonight. This was an awesome one. But as always, I am Professor Casey.
And I'm Professor Nick.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, guys.